The Macabre World podcast is brought to you by Darker Art Studio, home of real human bone jewelry. Stock and custom pieces are available, so visit us on the web at www.darkerartstudio.com and show them your darker art side. Macabre World, a podcast from Darker Art Studio, where we explore the dark, strange, and unusual from this world and beyond. Hello and welcome to the Macabre World podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Digati, and with me today is David Edward, the author of Atlantis Solved, the final definitive proof that was published in 2022. David, welcome.
Rocky, thank you for having me. Hey,
it's good to be here. And you're also a former resident of South New Jersey, up in the Cherry Hill area.
Yeah, we were just talking about that. I have nothing but trauma and repressed memories from my time in New Jersey.
So you're a native then?
Yeah, that's the word they use, right?
Don't write me letters, people.
Yeah.
Don't write me letters about that. You all know I'm a transplant, and I kid, I jest. Okay, so it's kind of people have heard of Atlantis. I think a lot of us have. I can't lie, especially growing up, the first thing one would think of when we think of it is the ad for sea monkeys on the back of comic books.
Yeah, for sea monkeys, sure, okay.
The ad for sea monkeys, and we're picturing these sort of like partial or Aquaman and Poseidon. We have a lot of mythological and really far-fetched kind of concepts about Atlantis, and I also heard legends that were particular to where my mom's family are from in the Azores of Portugal. So there's always been some kinds of theories, and there's a lot of crossover that mainly stems it to myth and legend. What I think is interesting is that you're really not talking about myth and legend. We're talking about cartography. We're talking about geology. We're talking about where this place actually was, how you figured out where it was. So if you could tell us a little bit about your background and why Atlantis. How did this happen? How did your journey start?
Yeah, so I guess working backwards, why Atlantis? I was probably one of the better sea monkey customers, just so you know. As a little kid, I had them. I don't know what the hell they actually were, roaches or something, but I had a little
shrimp.
Some kind of shrimp. Yeah, I don't know. I had a little.
Shrimp.
I followed the instructions. I had a little glass. I made a little aquarium. I put it in the light, and it was always by the sink. And I would go through those things. I don't know, 4 or 5 or 6 packs a year as a kid. So I didn't know what they were, but. Yeah, so I started, and as a kid, I was always interested in this stuff. Who isn't, right? We all gravitate to something. So I'm an old guy, I always point out, and I grew up in the 70s and 80s. And during the 70s and 80s,
careful about that old bit, okay? We're of an age.
Just me, just saying me. That's my worldview, right? So, but during that time, it wasn't like today where there's YouTube and so much content and places you could go. So if a new book was put out about Atlantis or a documentary came on TV, it was kind of a big deal. So I watched all of those, and the books and the TV shows always had kind of the same setup. And if it was an hour TV show, the first half hour was like, got you really excited about it. It showed you, good looking people and beautiful locations, usually in the Mediterranean. They're going to big diving islands. They're showing you blue water. We're watching them swim around, and they're telling you they figured it out. And then the second half hour is them kind of going, well, we didn't really figure it out. In order for this place to be it, then Plato had to get this wrong, and we have to change this in history, and we have to change this timeline. And maybe it's one of these 3 or 4 places we looked at, but we had a really good time. Thanks. Watch the next show. And then Leonard
Nimoy gives you the sign off. Remember In Search Of? I think that's the first place I actually heard a more less folkloric approach to it.
I watched all the In Search Of. I love it.
Oh yeah, it was a great show.
Yeah, I didn't like. They brought it back, but they're bringing everything back. They brought it back a couple years ago. I didn't watch it, So that I went through that whole cycle, and after a while, you get older, and that kind of, I don't want to say it didn't wear on me, but I got tired of the same setup and the same stories and all of that. So I switched, and in high school, because I was a nerd, I started reading a lot of the classical Greek stuff. So I've read all of Plato. I've read all of Plato probably 3, 4, 5, even 6 times some of his works. I've read Herodotus's The Histories, and just a ton of literature from that time period that I became interested in. It's just kind of where Atlantis points you to if you've
Right.
got nowhere else to go. And then that faded, and then I got out of high school, went to college. I dropped out of college pretty quickly because it wasn't for me. Joined the military, which was and I always tell people I wasn't all I could be. I did more before 9 a.m. than they do all day, which again hints back to just which marketing campaign I went in under. But I got lucky. I joined as what they call 11 Bang Bang, 11 Bravo infantry, but I did really good on my ASVAB scores, so they recruited me into what they call counterintelligence. 97 Bravo was my MOS. So I was a counterintelligence agent. I mean, just the most amazing job you could ever want. I got through a lot of really cool investigations. The training they give you, they train you in 2 things, at least when I went through. One was what they call battlefield counterintelligence, and the other is what they call human intelligence, basically collecting data from people. The battlefield counterintelligence, it was really interesting. It provided me with skills that I used when I came into the Atlantis world. Basically, what that means is we look at the things we do, both on a post. We look at what our soldiers are doing, we look at what their families are doing. Do they always go and buy baby formula before a big deployment? All that kind of stuff. And then we put it together and we try and figure out the big picture, and we say, based upon the things we see, what do we think they're really doing? And you can imagine how that would factor in with Atlantis. Then I had the chance to re-enlist in the military, and I decided that college didn't look anywhere near as bad as I had originally thought. And I went in, the military provided me the tools I needed, the discipline and the ability to get stuff done. So I finished. I have a bachelor's in business. I have like 3 graduate degrees, and I have a doctorate in engineering. I was president of a university for a while. I know the academic side. I am not a member of that world, but I'm familiar with it, and I can navigate it up and down. So that's kind of my background. I've written about 45 books, about evenly split between history books and non-history, basically historical fiction. I tend to write in past time periods. So I don't know. I watched all the Macabre World podcasts I possibly could. I'd listened to all of them on Apple Plus and on YouTube and everything. And I'd gone through your content 5 and 6 times, and I was kind of out of stuff. And I'm an old guy, so I know I can't sleep at night, right? So it's like 2 a.m. I'm out of stuff to watch, and YouTube says, "Hey, watch this video from this guy Jimmy Corsetti on this channel, Bright Insight." So I'm like, I don't care, fine, whatever, play it. And he's talking about Atlantis, and the video was from 2018. And this is just less than a year ago that I was doing this. So I'm kind of late to the story. But he very famously reintroduced this thing called the Rishat structure to the world. I kind of credit him as the guy who first associated with Atlantis. The more research I've done, that's not exactly the case. People have been eyeing this up, but he was certainly the first one to take it seriously and do a lot of research and present a lot of research with it. So I watched his videos, and because I had that background coming in of being familiar with a lot of the literature that he's quoting from, my feeling was twofold. He seemed like a great guy. I've talked to him because I didn't want to write a book and kind of move into his world without at least letting him know what I was doing. But he was kind of coming out from a layman's point of view, and he got a few things wrong, and there were cases where he was challenged, and sometimes the answer he was trying to provide in the challenge, maybe there was a better way to go about it, or if we could lead more on the history, that kind of stuff. So I wanted to jump in and help, because I think he's right. I think he found it. So that kind of then spurred me to write the book. I also met another guy named David Hansen, who had been to the Rishat structure, which is in Mauritania in West Africa, because I did want to make sure I talked to people that had been there. So I had that perspective. I've also, since I've written the book, I've had geologists look at it. And I've talked to a lot of folks on it. Many folks have different views than I have, but it seems to me like we're onto something with this location. And the approach I took in the book is to deconstruct what Plato tells us about it down to basically requirements, which, it's a very modern idea. We're modern people, though. And then I say, well, how does it meet all these requirements? And it turns out when you lay them all out, and the other thing you have to do, which is hard, right? It's part of what we'll talk about, is you've got to push all the other noise and all the other stuff that we've imagined or dreamed or been told or watched or read about Atlantis. Now, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, I'm only telling you where it was and what Plato said about it. If there really were nuclear submarines and spaceships and power crystals, I'm not saying no to that. I'm just saying I don't know anything about that. But if they were, I can tell you where they were on the planet, because that's the piece that Plato kind of leads us to. And I think I think it's not widely accepted, but I do believe that the book and the work I've done absolutely proves it. And now we just have to start getting that idea out there and letting people see it, so they can either agree or disagree or challenge, or find more supporting evidence.
So basically, we're talking about location, actual physical location, as far as what they had for technology, where they're from originally, because there's a lot of theories that they were extraterrestrial, etc. That's really not what this is. This is about the where.
Where and the when.
The where and the when.
Yeah.
The where and the when.
And
now, there are a lot of theories too. I mean, I grew up hearing about Atlantis, which it may sound strange unless you have an Azorian mother. Then it's very normal.
Well, the Azores, we talked about the Azores. Many people think it was the Azores. And I think it was the Azores might have been part of the kingdom, because we've got three things we're dealing with. We're dealing with the capital city, which is what we all talk about, and it's that center island and the rings and all that stuff. Then we've got the continent, and then we've got the kingdom. And I think something like the Azores fits really well with the kingdom. In fact, there's references to it in Plato that I often mention. He tells us that the kingdom of Atlantis, and we're kind of working backwards, was comprised of 10 provinces. The first province, he says, was the capital city, and it was ruled by King Atlas. And of course, that name is important because we have the Atlantic Ocean. We also, where this West Africa Rishat structure is, we have the Atlas Mountains just right to the north. So that name permeates. But then he says there were 9 other provinces, and he gives us the names of all of the rulers. And they were 5 sets of twins to get to 10. I don't know if that's important or not, but that's what he says. And the eldest of the 5th pair of twins was named Azores, which and he was the prince of the province of the Diving Islands, which I think points directly to the Azore Islands. I also looked up, where does that term Azores come from? And you had mentioned Spain and Portuguese and all those things. And sure enough, linguistically, no one knows where the name came from, but the roots of it are in the language that was spoken in Spain. So it linguistically traces to Spain, which people have also found interesting earthworks in Spain, which they say, well, maybe this was Atlantis. And one of the things that I do is I say, we need a grand unifying theory, because as humans, we say, well, maybe this is Atlantis. Well, if that's Atlantis, then this over here can't be Atlantis. It's like, well, they're not all the capital city, but the capital city is a very specific thing that we can actually find, because Plato tells us a lot about it. But I think they are part of the Atlantean Empire. So all the other things that are being found, I think, are legitimate. And I think it all melds in. So the fact it's the Rishat structure, I think, brings in all that other stuff you've heard and all those other theories more than it pushes them away, or more than it dismisses them.
Well, that makes sense, because, to consider a civilization, that's like saying, well, we found New York City. Now, Los Angeles can't exist if we find New York.
Exactly.
It's all part of it.
Right.
When I was growing up, on the island of San Miguel in the Azores, is an area called Siete Ciudades, and that means 7 cities.
Okay.
Which is, I think, kind of figures in a little bit too.
Yeah.
And there is a very stunning, and if folks want to look this up, SIETECIDADES, Siete Ciudades is a very striking landscape of course, it's very craggy, volcanic, and lush, full of hydrangeas and all kinds of things. And there are 2 lakes. One is distinctly blue in the water, and one is distinctly green. Now, I think I'm not going to assume that this is the actual reason there's a blue lake and a green lake. And I'm going to kind of maybe say it has a little bit more to do with the different lichen algae and all kinds of other flora and fauna in the lake. But the story, and it's a folk tale, it wasn't necessarily presented as fact, that we were told is that there was this beautiful princess whose father was the king of the underwater kingdom. So it is directly referenced.
Yeah.
And it rose up, and when the kingdom rose up, she was to take an earthbound husband. He was interviewing nobility. She falls in love with the shepherd boy. He has blue eyes. She has green eyes. When the father, the evil king, says, no, you can't have your true love. They both fall into a fit of what can only be described as Portuguese hysteria. I've seen it. It's not pretty. And in dramatic and incredibly romantic of fortune, they both perish after crying lakes of tears.
Okay.
And the one lake of tears from the blue eyes is blue. The one lake of tears, and that was so. It's a story of an evil Atlantis kind of king and his beautiful daughter who falls in love with a commoner, and he tries to split them apart, and they Romeo and Juliet the whole thing, and cry lakes of tears that correspond, which is very romantic. And I get it, it's a little bizarre, but you know, but that was what. But this whole underwater kingdom, and it was something it's spoken of commonly.
Yeah, well, you know, when you start to so Atlantis gives us a milestone marker or a marker in time. And Plato tells us that it happened 9,000 years before this guy Critias's great-great-great-great-grandfather went to Egypt in 600 BCE, which is where he found out about Atlantis. So you add those numbers together, you get 9,600 BCE, which is like 11,600 years ago from where we are. But that date is actually a very important date, and that goes to the story you just told, which is that's the end of the last ice age. So if we have lots of ice in the North and South Pole, although the South Pole maybe is arguable, but if we have lots of ice on at least one of the poles, if not both of them, the ice has to come from somewhere. It tends to come from the oceans. So the water level goes down because it's all tied up in the ice. So things like the Azores, right? A lot of what was going on and maybe some interesting things that would lend a lot of insights into our ancient history are now below the ocean. And this, you find this everywhere. It's so well known now. And it's hard to believe that even 20 years ago, this was just emerging as an idea that there might be stuff under the ocean that we find interesting, you know, from a mainstream. I hate that term, but that's the term we use. So it's a very new idea, but I think now that we have it and you go, look, there's stuff everywhere, all over. And anything that happened in 11,600 BC, that was, I'm sorry, 9,600 BC, 11,600 years ago from now, that was advanced. Most of it's going to have been around water, so most of it is now underwater. Now with Atlantis, we get lucky, which I can go into why it's not underwater right now, even though Plato tells us that it was, you know, destroyed a day and a night and fell under the waves. But yeah, I think the empire of Atlantis and all the seafaring things we see, I think they absolutely exist, and they're actually part of the same socio political structure. And I think now most of it's underwater.
Well, every once in a while, and unfortunately, Chad, I think it was in 1980 that there are terrible earthquakes in that area.
Yeah,
it's in the mid-Atlantic region for those folks who aren't familiar, and because of it being, you know, full of, you know, volcanoes and legendary passionate people, every once in a while stuff kind of shakes up, and there's been some very, very tragic. You know, all kidding aside, my family lost everything, and their home and everything. There's been some very devastating earthquakes. So it has been, to this day, in our day and age, in our lifetimes, is volatile and shifts.
Right.
That area is a little shaky.
The whole ridge is very thin. And that's when we look at 9,600 BC, I said it was the end of the last ice age, something happened. And within about a year, the temperature of the earth rose 30, 40, 50 degrees. Now, no one's suggesting that the catastrophe was slowly rising seawater, but that's not really what would happen, because if the ice is melting, then the pressure, the weight that's on that plate, which is very thin, is shifting. And then we all know, especially along that ridge, if it shifts in the wrong way, one side goes up and the other side goes down, you have an earthquake, and the side that goes up creates a tsunamis, which we've all seen. In fact, I was just reading, I think today, as we're recording this, there was a 7.3 or 7.6 Richter scale earthquake in Mexico, and there was a little mini tsunami around a lake in in the Grand Canyon or something, just like inside the canyon, you know, because the water shifted, right? It was all in one place, and then the earth shook and shifted a little bit, and it kind of sloshed around back and forth. So it happens all the time. A tsunami, in our lifetime, the largest recorded tsunami is 1,700 feet tall. That's a tall tsunami. That's just our lifetime.
Where did that happen?
I don't know. You have the ones off of Japan.
Yeah, I know. Usually it's somewhere.
There's a lot in the Indian Sea too. They tend to have them.
Asian and Indian areas.
Yeah,
and I don't think I don't think I could handle seeing something that big coming at me.
Well,
Because that's just like,
the bad news is you don't get to watch it for very long.
good point. Fair point.
It's bad
Fair
news, but
point,
yeah. So,
Well, it's like a riot. If you see it, you're in it.
yeah,
You know?
exactly. That's good. That's good.
No such
advice.
thing as observing a riot.
Yeah.
If you see it, you're in it.
If you see it, you're in. Yeah, stop, drop, and roll. Fetal position in the corner.
That's
Right.
it. If you can't be a riot voyeur. Apparently not a tsunami voyeur. If you see a tsunami, you're in it.
Yeah, you're in it. That's right.
You're in it. So, and I think that it's one of the questions I had, and you kind of eloquently addressed that, is that it is not, it more proves rather than disproves that there are other places that are considered, that have been mentioned in conversations, even besides my beloved Azores. There's also, I think there are places down in the Caribbean, in places, I think one outside Belize, and there are some very, specific areas where people think that Greece, I think, has a claim to fame at one point.
Yeah.
Where they, and I think that makes so much more sense that it's all part of the one. And I always learned that the reshot was the Eye of the Sahara. Is what I always heard it called.
Yeah.
And that would be home base, the capital.
Look, I mean, I don't want to introduce speculation, but you know more myths than I do. But there's this term, navel of the world. And when you look at where this thing is and what would have been a very green and lush Africa, and you look at what it looks like, it sure does look like a navel in the middle of the world to me. Now, I'm not claiming that, but by establishing this time, and we can talk about what was going on at this time. Here's the cool thing: is the Richat structure is real. We can all go look at it.
Yeah, it's a real thing. It's not. It's not a real fable. Yeah,
it's there. This date, 9600 BCE, is a real date. I mean, it really happened, and all of the geological and atmospheric and temperature things that we think were going on at that date fit perfectly with what Plato says, because that date was the date of some kind of cataclysm, and he tells us about a society that was impacted by the cataclysm. So it puts down a marker, and when you accept that marker, all this other stuff falls in line. Let me Göbekli Tepe. We familiar with Göbekli Tepe? Have you heard of that?
No.
Okay, Göbekli. It's very famous. Recently famous. It was found in like the 50s or 60s. It's in Turkey, and it is a massive set of earthworks and almost megalithic, big rocks, and some big rocks, not so big like the pyramids and the stuff you see in Peru that you have no clue how they could have handled it, but still pretty big, more like Easter Island, big, Moai, right. Kind of big. And
I missed this. I'll have to look it up. That's cool.
Well, but it dates to 9600 BC. It dates to the exact date of Atlantis, and it provides us with, and it's accepted from a mainstream standpoint, and it provides us with a pretty good eyeball of what the idea of advanced might look like at exactly this date, because these are people transitioning from being hunter-gatherers into agriculture. It's a big agriculture site. There's clearly a society. There's clearly specialized workers in it. All of the things that we would want to see around an advanced society are present in Göbekli Tepe, and it has only in the past 10, 20 years been accepted as the date of 9600 BC has been accepted from a mainstream standpoint. They don't know what to do with it, but they can't deny it. That's the date. So we start to see what Atlantis would look like. It would have been able to move rocks and build buildings and do earthworks and do the types of things we see at Göbekli Tepe, which isn't even that far away from Western Africa. It's still, a tangentially Mediterranean society. So we have that. A couple other things happened just to make us kind of ready to accept Atlantis. The first happened 150 years ago with Hendrik Schliemann finding Troy. Have you heard of that?
Yes.
Yeah. And the interesting thing there is what he said he did is he said he took the Iliad and the Odyssey, mostly the Iliad, and he decided to treat it as history. And he said, let's just look at when they talk about stuff, when they say how far away something is, they talk about the geography, and let's treat that as history. Let's go try and find a place that the Greeks could have gotten to in 1200 BCE, and let's see if we can find something that matches. And the other interesting thing with Troy is they'll say, well, we think that the real Troy is Troy 7. Well, what the hell's Troy 7? What does that mean? Right? Well, and what they're talking about is the layers where there was a city and then something happened and then it was rebuilt on top of it. And there's like 9 or 11 or more layers where that location was rebuilt constantly over and over and over again. And when they dig down, They think the seventh one is the one that kind of dates to what they read in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So we have that, and then there's a guy who we all memorized in probably sixth or seventh grade history, and then immediately forgot. His name was Francis de Orania, and he was the first Westerner in 1542 who traversed the Amazon River all the way from the eastern side all the way to the western side. And if you look in history books right now, today, what it says is he did all this, and when he reported it back, he claimed that he saw massive civilizations and huge stone buildings and all kinds of society and astronomy and just amazing things all over the place. And then people went back 100 years later, and none of it was there, so everyone said he was lying, and he was just trying to raise money to get, to either get rich or, to go back or to do something.
Right.
Well, just in the past 2 or 3 years, LiDAR has proven that he was right. So we've been teaching for 500 years that this guy was a liar and that he didn't see all these buildings, and that the society was very primitive in the Amazon and stuff. And now with LiDAR, we can see this stuff everywhere. I mean, absolutely everywhere. The entire Amazon was almost cleared. There was nothing but the pyramids like we see in Mexico and stuff, and roads and all kinds of stuff. And that's just, like I said, within the past couple of years. The other thing I point out that we're ready for is in May of this year, we found that a 23rd species of human that has existed on the planet. I don't even know what that means, 23 species of human. But we just found that this year. If we were talking about last year, we would have said there were 22. Now there's 23. So, I mean, so it's clear that our history is much older than we think it is, and that the current mainstream view, or the view we were taught, is evolving because there's so much evidence just pushing it farther back in time.
Well, I've been to the ruins of Tulum, and I've seen and read articles about things like the fish weirs in some of the early civilizations that you'll see in Central and South America, which I think is brilliant. And I don't think a lot of people understand like just how crazy smart a fish weir is. And I didn't know what a fish weir was until I actually met somebody who did a study on them, and I believe he was in the Machu Picchu kind of area. And it's those little mazes built out of stone walls that when it floods, the fish get caught. It's like a stone fish net and it's crazy. So there's a lot of technology, and that's somebody thinking that through, kind of
yeah, right. Yeah.
They thought it through, and they found out, when the water rises, if I build these like stone fish traps, when it recedes, all the fish stay in the trap. Hey. And that's fishing in a barrel, ain't it? So there's all this is crazy stuff. I have to admit, and this is bizarre. We were talking, like I said, about the Mediterranean seems to be a highly concentrated area between the Greeks and, like I said, Plato writing about it. And you mentioned Mauritania. We talked about the Azores. In between Mauritania and the Azores are the Cape Verde Islands.
Yeah,
they're kind of sort of right there. And that, so are we just blaming Portugal for this, or
well, maybe Portugal, Portugal, or at least Spain, they think they found stuff that seems to tie to the kingdom of Atlantis. Some people like it because they found a circle. Anytime someone finds someone who dug a circle, everyone just screams Atlantis. But it's the Canary Islands. It's interesting you mentioned them, because one of the things that Plato tells us about Atlantis, he says, it was outside the Hillers of Pericles, which we think is the Strait of Gibraltar, and he tells us that there were islands. So you kind of went directly out of it, which West Africa is directly out of it. Morocco, which is the Atlas Mountains, for God's sakes, Atlantis, Atlas. And then he said you sailed to it, you went by some other islands and stuff, and that the way to Atlantis was also the way to the opposite continent. So that which is a really heavy statement, but I'm going to get back to the Canaries in just a second. But remember, this is coming from Egyptian priests in 600 BCE. And Plato gives us a chain of custody. This isn't made up, it's not an oral tradition, but this means that Egyptians in 600 BCE knew about the opposite continent.
Yeah, that was my question. As you said that, I'm saying, when did anybody actually know? Because obviously, as much as I would love my Sicilian late father would cringe to credit Christopher Columbus with anything other than starting a really bad trend. There, obviously people had been to this continent prior to, either by walking over from a larger landmass when,
that's the other way. Yeah, no, they had boats. And, you mentioned, your setup, Rocky, couldn't have been more beautiful. You mentioned the Canary Islands, and then you mentioned Columbus.
Yes.
So, right. So Plato tells us that, you go outside these pillars of Hercules or Heracles, whatever, and then you go by some islands, and it's on the way to Atlantis, and then it's also the way to the opposite continent. Well, so I was like, okay, well, we would need some things to be true for that. So I looked at the ocean tides, and sure enough, you come out of the Strait of Gibraltar, the currents take you down the west coast of Africa, and they are also the easiest way, off the tip of Africa over to the tip of South America. But then I was like, but people don't like that. People want them, actually, you're from the Azores. They want them to go straight out, straight out a little north, because they think that's the way. They write straight out and then to the Azores. So I was like, well, how did Christopher Columbus do it? How can I test the theory? And Columbus is the only one I can look at, because he's the only one that we have a really well documented source for, where he theoretically hoped there was an opposite continent, and he had old documents. He didn't really know how to get there. But he's a good navigator and a good.
Columbus was not the navigator.
Oh, you know what?
This was, I have to
no, it's good. No, that's good. And I'm going to mention another navigator later, but you know what? Yes, thank you. No, you're right.
Every October, you knew it was Columbus Day in my household when my Sicilian father and Portuguese mother had the same argument every year. My dad would come down and go, hey, happy Columbus Day today. Columbus discovered America. And my mom would be like, listen, Joe, first of all, all of his navigators were Portuguese. And that's, and she would say the Spanish Armada was not, because that was all Portuguese navigators. They may have been sailing under Spain, but it was Portuguese people that were navigating those, because we were the best navigators in the entire universe and everything. And he's like, oh yeah, how come you can't find your way home from the Brightman Street Bridge in Fall River, Linda? And then it just got ugly from there. And it was every year, but arguably, so we used to Columbus the Navigator. All I could picture was, I've taught my mom how to listen. She's 94 on Alexa. If I didn't jump in, I'd be punished.
No, but you bring up an amazingly important point, because you're right. The way ships work is you have the captain, then you have someone who's in charge of the maps and stuff, and that'll be important later. When Columbus first tried to do this, and he trusted his Portuguese navigator to figure a way out, they sailed down to the Canary Islands, and they didn't know what to do, so they headed directly west. Right. And if you remember, and this is his first trip, he actually took 4 trips. So the first trip, and if you remember, the first trip was viewed as kind of a disaster, because they get about halfway there, and because of the way they went, because of his navigator, they took themselves out of the ocean currents. So they're kind of sitting in the middle of the ocean. The current isn't really doing much, and there's no wind. It took them 10 weeks, to sail. And like for 2 of those weeks, there's no wind, and they're eating seagulls and having arguments, and it's just it's a mess. And now eventually they get there. When he went the second and third and fourth time, when he knew what he was doing, he went to the Canary Islands, and then he kept going down the coast of Africa, and he followed the currents over, and they were much easier journeys. So what's interesting about all of that is that directly supports what Plato tells us about Atlantis being in West Africa, this Mauritania thing. Because when you look at, let's talk about another navigator. There's a guy, he was a contemporary of Columbus's, named Piri Reis. Now, he was an Ottoman, and he famously commissioned a map called the Piri Reis map in 1514, something, because see, Columbus was 1492, and then Piri Reis commissioned this map 21 years later. So whatever 21 and 1492 is, 15, 14, 50, whatever it is. And he did it for the same reasons we were just talking about, which is if we're now sailing around the world, he wanted to take all the ancient maps that the Ottomans had access to and compile those into one map that he could use to kind of find his way around. The map is famous because it seems to show on the left-hand side more about the New World than could have been known in 21 years after Columbus. It seems to show, the bottom of the map seems to be interesting. It seems to show the South Pole, Antarctica, without ice. And it seems to show the continental shelf, which would have been exposed in the time we're talking about, 9600 BCE, not 1540 AD.
Right.
Now, there's arguments against that, but that's not what we're interested in. What we're interested in, also on this map, and we've all been staring at this thing for a very long time. It became Charles Hapgood made the map kind of famous, and Graham Hancock in 1995 opened his book Fingerprint of the Gods with it. So it was kind of viewed very authoritatively. But on the right hand side is the coast of Africa, and anyone can search for this map and look at it. And inside the coast of Africa, exactly where this Rishat structure is on this map, 500-year-old map, is this kooky little city on an island in a ring of water in the middle of the Sahara Desert.
Which seems unlikely. I mean, it just, when we pictured the Sahara Desert, when, the layperson who may not know, all of the geological history through the ages in that area, we picture desert. There's no water. You don't really picture much, maybe an oasis here and there, but,
Not now. No, right now it's exactly what you think it is. It's just hundreds and hundreds of miles of 140 degrees wind and sand. It's awful. But so, we were talking about navigators, Piri Reis as the navigator isn't going to accept a map that has a river going up where there is no river into the middle of Africa. And they know the coast of Africa where there's a kooky city surrounded by a ring of water. He's not going to accept that as unless it was based on something they trusted, which would be one of these older maps that seems to be reflected all over this thing because of the water levels and because of some of the detail on where just people hadn't been. So I think that map corroborates what Plato tells us. One of the other things that Plato tells us is he tells us that Atlantis, the city, was actually 3,000 stadia inland, up a river, and he tells us this.
Stadia.
Stadia. And
I understand it's a unit of measurement. I understand cubit's a unit of measurement, but I don't know what each one measures. So
sure,
if you could give us a little guideline on picturing what stadia are.
Yeah, and there's some controversy around. There's several different accepted measurements of this thing called a stadia. When Plato wrote, he's writing in 350, 360 BCE ish. He was Alexander the Great was born 12 years before Plato died, so Plato is probably writing about Atlantis during Alexander the Great's lifetime. The Alexandrian measure of a stadia is 607 feet. It's pretty well accepted. So when I did the book and did the research, I looked at all the different measurements, and I'm like, this is just the one that fits historically to what Plato would have been aware of.
Right.
So all my measurements. So anytime Plato says something's a stadia, in your head think that's 607 feet. That math is a little hard to do. But when you want to know how far 3,000 stadia is, you multiply 3,000 times 607 and divide it by 5280 or whatever a mile is. And that math comes out to 345 miles. So,
good. I'm glad you gave me the answer because only one of us can do math.
Well, I've done the math already, so I just have it in my notes in all fairness. But I used artificial intelligence to calculate that out, just so you know. It was Amazon Web Services helped me figure that out. But anyway, so you look at this and everyone ignores it because it's an inconvenient measurement. There's the Bimini Islands or the Azores or Santorini. You can't fit 345 anything on there, much less miles.
Right.
But so when you measure the distance, and you can see there's a clear waterway, you can actually see the sand in the water receding from the tsunami that probably hit this thing, but it is 345 miles inland. So now we have a measurement that matches what Plato said. The Rishat structure also looks like what he said Atlantis, the city, looked like. It has a center island or center structure, and then alternating rings of very high land and rings of very low land. And there's 2 additional rings to very high land. We know in 9600 BCE, this is during what they call the Green Sahara, and there was lakes that would have run through here, or rivers, sorry. So this would have been in a lake. It would have been a massive lake of like 25 miles across or so. But we can see that. So it looks like Atlantis. And he tells us other things. He says that the Atlanteans dug a canal, 50 stadia from the outer ring to an inner harbor. So, okay, well, that gives us the radius, right? Because that's how circles work.
Right.
If you know the distance from the middle to the outside. So 50 stadia is 5.8 miles. So the question is, well, what's the radius of the Rishat structure, the Eye of the Sahara? Well, you look, it's 5.8 miles. Plato tells us that it had mountains to the north and was open to the south. Well, the Rishat structure has mountains to the north, and it was open to the south. It is open to the south. He tells us that there was lots of precious metals in Atlantis. Well, Mauritania's biggest export is gold and iron. He tells us it was geographically related to Libya, Egypt, Greece, and Europe because the Atlanteans conquered Libya as far as Egypt and parts of Europe around the Mediterranean. So they have to be geographically, they have to be related to it, they have to be close enough to it for that to have made sense.
And continentally, the Libya and Egypt touch it, don't they? Or very close to it.
Very cool. Libya. So the border of Libya today extends very far into Africa. And then I think you have, I don't have a map in front of me. I think you have Mali, and then I think you have Mauritania, something like that. Yeah, Libya definitely comes in.
But one of the things, and this lends to the whole Sahara Lake thing, is, and I always have to, because I enjoy historical and unusual ancient history as well. You cannot look at it with your modern eyes.
No, you got to know.
You can't assume where the border is now is where the border was then. We make a lot of assumptions. And I think that's just, because there's so much information and there's so much, people think there's so much little to discover. I disagree with that. Now that, so well, doesn't Libya touch it? Well, Libya touches Mauritania or does not touch Mauritania. Those borders are there now. They weren't there hundreds of years ago. And we're talking about thousands of years ago. So it's all kind of, the borders are subjective.
They're subjective. Yeah.
The history, I should say, they're subjective to the time, to the time in history.
Yeah. And that's an important point. Because some of the definitions, just like the definition of a stadia, they tend to drift over time. Sure. The way things are said, right? The vocabulary tends to drift over time. So yeah, I mean, Plato's writing 2,500 years ago, and he's talking about something that happened 11,600 years ago. So we do have some drift, and we do have some things. One of the things people say, though, they'll criticize Plato, and they'll say that the story of Atlantis is an oral tradition. And so since it's an oral tradition, there's no way that whatever these measurements are held, because they had this drift problem that we're talking about. But that's not true. There's so much of what we think we know about Plato, and so much of the criticisms are inaccurate. Plato tells us specifically that this is not an oral tradition. He tells us, he's Critias, who's telling the story, and it's Critias' great-great-great-great-grandfather Solon who goes to Egypt. He says that when Solon goes to Egypt, he writes it down. And then Critias says, and my grandfather kept the scroll he wrote on, and I still have it in my possession, and I've studied it, carefully studied, and it's been carefully studied by me, he says. So this isn't an oral tradition about Atlantis. It is literally what the priest told this Solon guy before Plato. So it's a direct translation. We call it a chain of custody. There's a direct chain of custody of the information.
I think that, I think it's a crazy question to ask you, but how come nobody else put this together?
Well, they did. The Jimmy Corsetti guy did. I didn't invent the Rishat structure as Atlantis. What I've done is come at it for real, with a real academic background and real world training in the military. I pushed away the nonsense and what we would call the secondary sources. So I'm only dealing with primary sources, and then I've taken a very literal approach to it. And where blanks had to be filled in or questions had to be answered, I've actually done the research and come up with like a scientific answer or historical answer under the guise that part of what I'm telling you about Atlantis can't be that we have to pretend that these people are wrong or this measurement's off or any of that stuff. If we're going to find it, it's got to fit. And it does fit. We have the advantage that it does fit. But I think that people get lost with Atlantis because it can be anything, and they get excited. And they don't know how sometimes to research. Like here, one of the criticisms of this site, for example, is it sits around 1,300, 1,500 feet above sea level. So people will say, well, there's no way. It says it sank into the sea. Well, okay, but those same people will also tell you that they think it's a volcanic dome. Okay, so if we're dealing with the tsunami that dumped billions of gallons of seawater into a volcanic dome, wouldn't it have caused earthquakes, and wouldn't the volcanic dome have sunk, right? But eventually the water the water recedes. I forget what my point was. I had a really good point on that, but I can't remember what it was. I got lost.
I'm at that age too.
Yeah, I know. See, I keep saying I'm an old guy. Yeah. So anyway,
I think we're of an age, so careful with the old. But it and I actually, it's funny, all the stories I heard, and again, these are folk tales and legends.
Yeah.
All the stories I heard, it went down, it came up. It rose up and became a civilization.
Well, okay, let's talk about that. So Plato tells us that Poseidon fell in love with a mountain woman, and he made Atlantis for her. That's a very simplified version of what he kind of says. But who's Poseidon? Well, Poseidon's the god of the sea. So Plato is telling us that he thinks it was naturally formed out of the sea. So it kind of fits with that. With that, and I remember what my point was. My point was one of the criticisms is its elevation above sea level. So and they'll say water doesn't flow uphill, so it can't be Atlantis. Well, hold on, wait. If he tells us it was 345 miles, 3,000 stadia inland, and then you look at how weather works, right? How does weather work? How does rain work? Well, we have water in the ocean, the sun shines on it, gets hot, turns into, it evaporates and goes up into the clouds, and the clouds move over. Sometimes they rain over the sea, sometimes they move over mountains or land and they rain, which then causes rivers, and the rivers flow back to the sea, and it's a circle. And when you look at the elevation of this thing and you look at what was going on at this time period, 9600 BCE, and you look at the geography, it fits perfectly with a very gentle sloping river like the Nile or like the Missouri River in the US. I found places in the US where there are, you have the river and then you have big river, lakes upland of the river. So it fits perfectly. In fact, all the criticisms, when you actually look at them hard, they start to become strengths because they actually fit in with Plato told us if you take the time to actually read the whole thing.
And that's really, speaking of taking the time to read the whole thing, I am going to finish it. I know your book is, on Atlantis. It's Atlantis Solved, the Final Definitive Proof by David Edward is available, but you're also a very prolific writer.
You're voluminous. If yeah.
Do you have what's your website?
The website, the publisher website is frequency99.com. The nines are numbers, frequency99.com. And that's got all my books on it. It's got other people's books on it too. And it's got I think the Atlantis book is still the headlining book. It came out in April.
Well, it's big news.
I think it's big news. I think the thing's been found, and I think it all of our suspicions about our ancient history going back 12,000 years or so, I think we now have. That's why I call it definitive proof. We have a milestone marker, and it glues it all together, which I think is it's fun to have a theory that unifies versus that excludes.
Has anybody ever done an excavation at that site, an archaeological excavation to find things?
Kind of. They've LiDAR'd the site. The guy mentioned David Hansen. We've had lots of people that have gone there. They've dug in places. We have the same problem that Schliemann had in Troy, which is about 150 years ago for us. The French Foreign Legion was all over this place, and then the Romans before them. So there's lots of structures, minimal structures, not impressive structures, but the remnants of them, and that's as far down as people go. They'll find something and it looks kind of cool. They say, "Was this Atlantis?" And like, no, it was the French. And they stop. But I have had a geologist look at it, and we do have things we found. In fact, and I know I'm writing another book. I got a documentary that should be coming out in summer of 2023, because one of the things Plato tells us is that the waterway to Atlantis was blocked in a shoal of mud, which is also why it can't really be an island somewhere, because the Atlantic Ocean isn't blocked with mud, so that doesn't make sense. It had to be a river, it had to be a waterway. But you can see on the maps, and it's actually even on the Piri Reis map, you can see where all with the big clumps of mud are. There's about halfway between the Rishat structure in the Atlantic Ocean. So I think that's where someone wants to dig, that's where we should dig. But Plato tells us they're very good at agriculture. And we have found canals, massive canals that he talks about, that are covered in something called evaporites, which is the salt after the water evaporates, and then the salt bakes in that desert heat for centuries. So I think it's been preserved to a degree. And there's 2 locations we found, and we're actually going to just go look at them next month. Because I think we're about to have something people can look, because everyone wants to look at something on ground, even though we're talking, 11,000 years after a giant cataclysm, it's a long time. But I think we got lucky with these evaporites, preserving some of the earthworks, and we're going to have that, and all that news will be breaking within, like I said, within about 6 months, I think.
So that's to be continued.
To be continued, yeah.
To be continued. Again, if folks want to look at all of your books, they can go to frequency99.com. You also have a podcast.
I do have a podcast. I talk to other writers about the writing process, hoping to get some advice so I can finally write a good book.
Well, there you go. Well, it looks like you've made a several false starts.
I've written lots of books. Yeah.
and your fiction works are heavily detailed with historical reference and military reference. I can see some of the titles behind you. So again, frequency99.com for David Edward, and Atlantis Solved, the Final Definitive Proof. I'm still going to blame the Portuguese for this.
Well, they actually play a big role in this. It's funny you brought that up. And the Azores, when you opened, it took me a while to zoom in on it. But yeah, you're right there in the middle of this thing. Like you said, you're in the middle of the riot.
See, Mom? See, Mom, I got him to say it. There you go. That was from my mom. My mom,
Okay.
Linda Digati, 90, going to be 94 years old. Loves the
bless her.
podcast. Yeah, she's fabulous. Thank you so much. And again, folks can go to your website, frequency99.com, and get information on everything. I think you're onto something. I'm very much looking forward to the documentary. Where can we look for that? Will
Gaia, Gaia. Well, they've agreed to distribute it.
Okay, and more information at Frequency 99. Keep up with what's going on.
Yeah,
Anything
breaking will come through Frequency 99. Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Anything you want to leave us with?
No, let me put my bone necklace and earrings back in, and I'm gonna head out and get some tea.
On you. All right, folks. Thank you so much, and thanks, folks, for listening. And remember, stay kooky out there. Thank you for listening to Macabre World. You can find us on the web at www.darkerartsstudio.com.